Hello everybody, welcome to the Q&A and critique number 62. It is now currently 2000 UTC Friday, and we're going to be working on a live stream digital art questions and answers event here in the Q&A and critique channel in the Bforartists Discord server. So this is the Let's Bforartists edition here in the Bforartists server, and I'm here with some friends. We've got Plebes today, Pers is here in the background, and also J-Bar has joined us, so nice to see you here. I hope you're doing well and feeling better as well. So today is a very cool topic today. To Plebes' request earlier in the week, we had a look at working with volumetrics, and we've been discussing a topic that I shared earlier in the first season of the Q&A about how to use two different render engines using scene management and compositing. So today we're going to take a practical look at creating a small little scene with volumetrics and using Eevee to render volumetrics, compositing onto a scene rendered with cycles. And after that, we're going to be using not a very well-known feature, but we're going to be working with animatable vector masks that we could use for color grading different areas of an image inside the compositor. So without further ado, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining today and for watching this video maybe later. Let's begin. So Plebes, are you comfortable with coming onto the microphone to explain a little bit of context about your question today?
Yeah, I think so. If the audio is bearable.
Yeah, it's fine. It's working fine.
Okay. Yeah, basically, I would like to do God Rays, but getting God Rays in just cycles isn't super easy, or I don't think barely possible. And it makes every environment look super much better, so that's a nice thing to have or to get.
That's right. We need to see if we can work this through. So let's make a quick little scene without, here I have the system loaded. I don't have a lot of things in my library, but I guess I will make a very rough scene with this background here. This is not an instance. I'll add this little color checker, maybe the shader ball. Let me just reset the view. So I got my color checker here. Using this in the correct place. Yeah. Right, so we have the color checker, we have the shader ball, and we have this backdrop. And we're going to start with some volumetrics. Simple volumetrics. So you mentioned a guard ray. So this is to help you highlight different parts of a scene, correct?
Yeah, theoretically, yes. I mean, it just looks nice by itself, but probably it would be wise to highlight something with it. Or use it as some kind of guidance line.
So this is a pretty random scene. I'm just going to throw in an electric motor as well in the background here. Nice and big electric motor. Let's set up a quick camera. Let me just home into like the view, get the camera view. Maybe log in a little bit like this. So the scene here, we could have this big electric motor that's in the background here. Then there is this like shader ball over here, which is going to be the thing we want to highlight. And then we have a color checker stand that is something that we want to take a look at for later. So with that, we're going to highlight, I guess, we're going to plan the shot so that the sky comes in from the left and highlights everything. So let's get rid of the current lights. start with nothing, which means we're in Eevee at the moment, so I have to delete the lighting cache. And inside of the default world, I'm just going to get rid of the light and start with nothing. And from there, we're going to create a modeled mode. I'm going to create a God Ray Gobo. So to do that, it's going to use this grid here and do this, like with faces like that. Go into face mode, and then I'm going to select checker the random. Whoops, sorry, unselect everything, then select random. And in this case, I'm going to change the seed a little bit to something a bit more interesting with maybe less ratio. There we go. So this is going to be my shadow caster. And this is what I'm going to use to cast the volumetrics behind a lamp. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a spot lamp. This is what I'm going to use to create a nice God ray. Turn on the widgets. Point to the shader ball from the back here. And then I'm going to use this light gobo or shadow caster front of the light. And let's go into the scene view. So at the moment the light is very weak. So let me just put this into a collection called LIT for my lights. And I'm going to work with that to create light. So first things first, we need to set up the light to be nice and strong. We want it to be, I don't know, 1000 watts. Very strong. Make the cone smaller. Maybe put the blend out a little bit. And maybe rotate it a tad. So it's a nice backlight. The next thing we need is some volumetrics. So the purpose of this concept is that we're going to use cycles to render a beautiful bounce light around the whole scene. So for example, this particular lamp should bounce onto this particular piece of machinery, and the rest of the scene should have some light from the environment, which I'm going to inject, but cast some shadows. Inside of Eevee, this is not the case because the light doesn't bounce inside Eevee unless I bake it into a radiance cache, but it's not going to be very accurate. Also, the reflections of this particular model, if we go inside of the assets, I'm going to add a very shiny metal out of my default library here of Bforartists. So let's find a really cool metal. Let's go into metals, and let's use this very shiny silver. So if I'm in Eevee, the reflections are going to be screen space, and so for example this chromium ball is showing the environment and everything's okay, and it's relatively looks interesting, but it's not very accurate. It doesn't have very good self-shadowing of the inside of the metal, and it's not picking up absolutely everything around the world because it is screen space. So we're going to use cycles to render the beautiful pass, but we're going to use Eevee to render the volumetrics. And now let's make some volumetrics. So I'm just going to create a cube so that I have a general, I guess you could say a bounding box for the volumes. Then I'm going to go into shading, create a new shader. I'm going to delete the principled BSDF, which is the default. And underneath the category shader, I'm going to choose a what's it called? Principled volume. In this case, I'm just going to plug it into the volume node. If we go out of the view and go inside the camera and turn on the rendered mode, automatically the default density has already started to create some God rays, which is nice. You have a very thick fog, maybe it's a bit too thick, so we can lower the density. So something a bit more realistic like this. And we're going to up the samples of the volumetrics. Turn on some volumetric blending or the detail into like 2 pixels so that it's very sharp. Up the samples to something nice. is going to maybe slow my computer down a bit too much. Give me a second as I drop it back down. 512 is too high. So put it to like 128. 512 is still too high. 512 is only for like heavier graphics cards. So I'm running a GTX 1060 at the moment. Blender maxes out at 256, so I was using double the samples that Blender's maximum can do. As you can see, it didn't crash, but it did slow down my computer heavily. But if you want high fidelity EEV volumetrics, then Bforartists is good for that. So 128 is nice. I'm going to turn on volumetric shadows as well to kind of increase the quality of the shadows. Maybe up the samples to that to maybe 48. And so now we got this nice looking God rays. If we take a look at this plane, we can move it around, we can scale it or make it bigger, and we can use this gobo to kind of create this interesting God ray effect. You can also move them together to bring it down just a little bit so that it's a bit more of a targeted shape coming in from the corner, and we're ready to start. So let's just organize our scene a little bit. To do that, we're going to rename this vol for volume, put a blue color. We got lit here, and everything else I'm going to put inside of another collection called the set. So here, color this green. This will be my set. Here's the camera. I'm going to put the camera inside the set, or let's just call it the setup. And everything else I don't need, so I'll just hide that, hide the extras. So I have these three collections: the setup, the volume, and the lights. And I'm going to now switch over to the scene view of the outliner. So in the scene view of the outliner, this is where we can manage our render settings per pass. And we're going to create a new empty scene. Let's create a new one, and we're going to call this the composite. And the scene that we're currently in, I'm going to call this Eevee. And then I'm going to do a linked copy of that particular scene. And I'm going to call that one cycles. So we have three scenes. I got this library scene that I don't need, so I'll just delete it. Okay, so we have the composite scene, the cycles scene, and the Eevee scene. So the Eevee scene contains the volumetrics, and the cycles scene does not. So when I'm inside the cycles scene, I'm going to turn off the volumetrics. And in the view up here in the top, I'm going to turn on hold out and viewport display and pass through and direct only. In this case, in the cycles scene, I have disabled the volume. So that means in the viewport, we don't have the volume bounding box to work with. We've got the gobo, we've got the light, so we got the shadows okay, and we've got everything ready to set up and go, but no volume. So I just disabled in the view layer, the volume layer. And then in Eevee, I have the volume layer activated, but in the setup, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on hold out. So what hold out does is if I go inside the rendered view, inside the setup, you've got to make sure all of the collections have hold out. What it does is it makes everything transparent. You have to do that with all of the collections. So you can see that I'm starting to create kind of like a mask of the volume inside of the scene. So now that I have this mask set up inside all of these collections, I can now work with this to create this background. So we got to prepare some things first before we can do the render. One thing we don't need is screen space reflections, ambient occlusion, so we can speed up the render. Motion blur, we don't need it. The volumetric settings are okay. Just turn the viewport. blending. And inside the color management, it's all the same. And inside the render settings, we're going to make sure that we have transparent turned on. If you're inside Blender, transparent setting is inside the film tab underneath the render settings here. But if you're inside of Bforartists, it's underneath the same output panel. So from there, we got RGBA and we got transparent. Now if we go to our cycle scene, now we're going to switch over to our cycle settings. I'm going to turn on GPU so it's nice and quick. In the viewport, turn on some denoising. In the render settings, we want some quick denoising, adaptive sampling. We want a time limit of 30 seconds so that we don't have to wait too long, with minimum samples of 16 or so. The denoise is turned on. Just going to use a simple settings of fast global illumination, and in the volume settings we don't have to worry about it too much, but just to keep in mind, the max steps is at 1024, which is practically like EV samples to some degree, except it's double 512. So we got the same filmic, performance is okay. In the viewport, I'll just drop it down to 2 so it runs a bit faster. There we go. And as you can see, the reflections on the metal are much nicer. The light is bouncing around the world in a nicer way. There's a shadow from the environment map on the ground cast from the metal. If we turn off the widgets, you can see that the reflections are much more accurate on everything. You can see that the reflections from the ground is bouncing up. There's light on the actual sphere from the actual ground, so it's much more beautiful. But for performance reasons and to avoid the noise from the volumetrics, we're going to use the volumetrics from Eevee. And now, let's switch over to compositing. Inside compositing, we're going to switch to the composite scene. We're going to turn on use nodes. And with that, we have a render layer. So we're going to copy the render layer and we're going to choose the cycles render and then choose the Eevee render. So with that, we're going to render the cycles layer. You could hit F12 to render both if you want, but it's all good. And also, I just want to give a shout out to Choco Cat and Killen for joining today, and also Shmuel. Thanks for connecting into the voice chat. So it's just given a moment to render. 75%, 87%, nearly there. I'm happy you joined today, Killen. We're nearly there. So basically, if you remember what we did with the Eevee scene, where we turn the collections into holdouts and how we have the linked data, well, the idea is that we take the volumetrics that renders over the holdout and we composite that on top of the cycles render. So that at the end of the day, when we want to render the scene, we only render the composite scene and it will render both the Eevee and the cycles render. So here we have the cycles render. It's all looking very nice, much better than an Eevee. And now let's render the Eevee render. It should be a couple of seconds, hopefully. And it's done. Okay, so now we have instant volumetrics. Obviously, we could probably up the samples a little bit just to get rid of this banding. So this banding here is caused by low shadow samples. You could turn off the shadow samples to get very soft volumetrics, or if you want deeper shadows, then you turn on this the shadow samples to get the shadow from the actual object. But right now I have about 48 samples, so it's best to crank it up to as high as you can when you do this. This will make your volumes darker, but with Eevee, the volume, the shadow samples is what causes this banding. In general, if you have just normal samples, you can have them relatively moderate to high, and you'll still get great detail. If you want really sharp definition, then I recommend you use 1 pixel distance, which Blender does not have. 2 pixel distance kind of destroys the fine detail. But with that, that's for like creating clouds or nebulas or things like that. So now we have both layers. So we got layer 1 and layer 2. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into our color menu, and we're going to use the mix node. And with the mix node, we're going to use something nice and simple. We're just going to mix on top of the other, turn on alpha, and when we view it, lo and behold, we had 1 or 2 seconds to draw the Eevee volumetrics, and we've rendered something out with cycles and composited it in. As simple as that. So with the Eevee volumetrics, I can save time on an animation, for example, animate these volumetrics in the viewport much nicer, and composite them back into the cycles render without sacrificing noise or render times when I have hardware limits. Obviously, cycles are much more faster than it used to be, but you can always work with different things. So here's some other tricks that you can do. You can use a map range node. And with this map range node, you can use also something like a soft light. Oops. Right. Lighten. You can use different types of blends to bring out different types of techniques if you want to bring out different things. For example, I'm going to use the alpha channel next. There we go. For example, I'm making it softer, or I'm making it really strong, and I don't have to re-render to control these guard rays to a certain degree. So what I did just now is I used the alpha plugged into the factor of the node here, the add node. I can also use something else like lighten, but lighten, as you can see, is starting to eat up the background. I'm using add, or you could use overlay as well. No, overlay is not going to work. Like add. You can use any type. And with that as well, I can also use another mix node to change the color. In this case, I'm going to go into the color mode. I'm going to make it red. Now I have this orange, or this green, or this blue, or this different type of colored volumetrics based on what I want it to be. So the power of compositing means I don't need to render very much. If I want fast rendering and you're using 3.4 or 3.3 of Blender or Bforartists, go into experimental settings and turn on the full frame compositor. Full frame compositor is fully featured, and turn on OpenCL, turn on buffer groups, and turn on 2pass, and turn on your edit to low. This will give you the fastest recompositing or compositing control of multiple nodes. So what it does is it buffers groups, so it renders a group, and if you do no changes to that group, it won't re-render it. And a 2pass means it will do the easy nodes first and then render the harder nodes later. And OpenCL means use your GPU. And the edit resolution means you render to a low resolution for preview purposes. On the render settings, you can keep it on high. And the execution mode, which is the experimental, if you have it to full frame, it means it commits the entire frame to your GPU or CPU instead of in tiles. So sometimes if you have a powerful computer or a more powerful chipset or more RAM or things like that, you can commit the entire frame and calculate it one time in one tile, which would be much faster than calculating multiple tiles when you have limited hardware. So those are some quick tips to get a slightly faster compositing control. So there we go. When I'm ready with this, I just need to plug the final result into the composite node and go to my render settings. Make sure I have my path set, the file settings set, and hit render. Render animation or render, and it will render both the cycle scene and the EV scene, and then composite them together just from this composite scene. 2 renders in 1. So, plebes, does this help you with the God race?
Yes, awesome.
Excellent. So earlier this week, please, you were working with a very beautiful piece with a dare inside of a ruins, overgrown ruins, and you were doing some color balancing. And you can use light groups. Yes, you can. With cycles, you can use light groups. I don't know if light groups work in EV, Blink. I'm not sure, but with cycles, I think you can. This is just another way of, like, for example, if you have a view layer with a different light group, you can use that. Traditionally, light groups would be done through view layers. So if you were inside the cycle scene and you have multiple lights, so here's one light here, what I would do is I would create a new view layer, and I'll call this light group 2, and I would maybe duplicate this. D for duplicate. And this I would hide the first group in view layer 2, and in the first layer I would hide the second group, and I would have 2 light sets on 2 different view layers. So that's one way of working it. Or you can create light groups, which is a concept that I think only works in cycles, where you can assign objects to particular lights, I think. And then from there in the compositor, you can use these light group settings or outputs from that particular layer. But in this case, if I have my 2 lights, I can choose the scene and I can choose the view layer. So now I can render one with one light, one with the other light, and have 2 separate lightings of the same scene. But light groups has a lot more finesse and control. Unfortunately, I don't know if it works in the viewport yet, and I don't think it works in EV yet. Yeah, Killen, you're quite right. Light groups only affecting a selected object is madness, but to let you know, it is a standard render setting that has existed in every other software but Blender for a very long time. The Blender really needs to play catch up here. Okay. That's right, even Mental Ray had it back in the day, 15 years ago. Okay, so on to the next topic. So the next topic I want to share today is called masking inside the compositor. So for example, if I'm here and I want to you notice that when I was in my composite scene, I have this kind of a reddish spotlight, right? But what happens if I want to change the color of the light of the ground? Well, in this case, I could use a mask and I could use some color control to change the spotlight of this ground. And to do that, the compositor has a very powerful access to use the inbuilt system of Blender masks. So what is a Blender mask node? So the Blender mask node is basically a system that gets a mask from the masking editor in the image editor, and from that you can use motion blur or feathering or a vector control with animated keyframes to control a particular mask of your composite. And to do this, you need to go to your image editor, change the view into mask mode, and we can create a new mask. And from this, I'm just going to use the render settings, the render result, or the viewer node, sorry, as my mask template. And inside of this mask mode, so I created a new mask. So now I can select the mask inside the compositor. Now, how does it work? Well, you have this timeline at the bottom. You have the end panel where you have mask layers and mask settings. And you have a number of menus at the top. So I'm just going to show menus. And inside the mask menu, we got transform, scale, feather, and we have a system for drawing, creating a mask. But first we need to create a mask layer. So Slink has asked, can we use a luma key? Yes, you can, but sometimes you don't want to use the luma key because, for example, the bright highlights over here on the actual metal, or the bright highlight on this ball, I don't want to affect. So the luma key is going to have an issue. I could use a luma key here, but I may need to mask the luma key to make it not affect everything in the scene. So I create a mask layer, and holding down Control and left click, I can start to, I have to make sure that my mask display is spline. And then Control left click, Control left click, Control left click. I can start to draw a mask. So you holding down Control and left clicking, I can, kind of like in I guess you could say a vector drawing program, you create this vector mask. So now that I created this mask, there's an ability to also go inside my transform settings and hit Alt S to scale feather. So when you press Alt S, this creates this kind of like this feather control, so that I can have the ability to feather the edge of this mask. So now that we've made this mask, you take a look here, you can see that it creates this mask system here. So I'm just going to go inside of my editor here and make sure that my feathering is smooth. Feather offset, I want it smooth. Interpolation ease, great. Now that I've got that smooth, I can use this mask in my color settings. So I'm going to grab the same color settings, put it inside here. I'm going to use this mask as my factor, so that when I look at the image, I've created this system. So why is the feathering not working? There's a setting that I missed. Plebes, could you help me out here? Which one?
Maybe you gotta pull it in the other direction.
Oh, right. Box. Of it. No. Mask settings. Feathering. I keep forgetting what it is. There was something that I needed to do to make it work. But another thing you can also do is you can also blur. Just a simple Gaussian. So now I've just you could use your compositing tools, and I think technically you can feather the edges to however you need them to be. But now I created a color mask for the ground here, so that when I view everything together, I can now change the colors of what I want of this particular ground light, and the color of the world of this particular light to whatever thing I want. There it is. There's the blue, there's the green, there's the red, and I can use this to control artistically, without needing to re-render my cycles render, the different parts of my scene. I can also use it to highlight, for example, a person's face, or I can use it to like a control with Photoshop or Krita or some other system for controlling my colors. So when I'm inside here in my scopes, I can work with my the different parts of the scene and work with them to bring out the correct part that I want to do. And the cool thing about these vectors or these masks is you can also animate them as well, and you can track them as well with other techniques and things like that, which I still need to learn. But this here is quite powerful to help you creatively, to some degree, control your scenes. So that's the topic for today, is how to use masks with the compositor, how to use volumetrics with Eevee to composite over cycles or vice versa, or any other render engine. For example, you could use LuxCore to render out the caustics of the scene and use cycles to render everything else, and use Eevee to render out the volumetrics, and use those three together with different AOVs or shader light passes and put them all together. And or vice versa, you could render an animation in Eevee and then render out the reflections from cycles and render out the vector data from cycles or the ambient occlusion from cycles and composite into Eevee to bring out higher quality Eevee renders. And you can like save time or use the power of different engines together in the compositor to create something new. Make sense? I hope. How we're doing for time?
Yes.
Oh, it's very fast today. So do you have any questions would you like me to go deeper into? Killen is writing. All is good. Is make it look so natural. Thanks. See why the feathering's not.
I think the spline is the wrong way around, so actually the green feather should be outside instead of inside.
Let's fix that. Mask. Switch direction. I think you're quite right. Nothing's working now.
Is the blur still activated?
Let me just mute it. Take a closer look. Yeah, now it's working.
Yeah, seems to be working now.
Excellent. So now I don't need this. You also need to make sure the feather is turned on node. Killen has asked, can you create a mask for the light? Yes, you could. So for example, something that Slink mentioned was using a luminance key. The luminance key is basically, it takes the brightness of the scene and creates a mask. So what you could do is you could create a simpler mask, which just chops off all of these highlights from over here, and then use the luminance masks to change the color. So in fact, you could do that on another frame, or get all of them and just going to select here. Just use this as like a corner. This, so that when I look at the mask here, I have one side that's higher, one side that's not. And then in my luminance key, I'm going to use a mixed node. And I'm going to use a multiply node. The other way. Okay, I need to invert it. So let me just invert. There we go. That's weird. Maybe I should draw the other way. So I'll put it around the other way. There we go. So I use the mask, whatever's inside the mask is my filter, and then I use the luminance key to drive where the light goes or how much the light goes. And instead of using the mask as my color factor, I use the luminance key with the mask. So let me just put it up here so it's a bit easy to understand. I use the mask, the luminance key, and multiply one with the other, and then I use the color node. Use that as the factor with my color node. So when I take a closer look, let's put everything together. Now the color is based on the luminance, on my lows and highs. And now I can, you can see that the highlight is brighter in yellow than the others, than the ground. If I can also clamp it, obviously. Let me just make sure my luminance key is fine. Make it more sensitive. Multiply node. And I can also use my range, my map range node as well to like get a bit more control. For example, my minimum, whoops. Put my maximum higher. Not too high. There we go. So you can affect your masks to whatever degree that you want. Then from there, you can use that to color everything that you need to the correct way that you want. Where the white spots have more light, the darker spots don't. Using a luminance key. So that's another way of creating a stylistic choice of control or relighting of your scene. When I change it to blue, well, we have a bit of a clamp there because I clamped it. In this case, it's from 1, so I don't want 1. Drops it down a bit. But yeah, you can work your math, you can work your different things to get different types of results. But right now I'm using it's burning out quite a bit from the luminance over here. But in general, that's the theory behind it. And with that, you're okay. I hope that answers the question, Killen. Good, it does. Excellent. All right. Oh, and just to give if you do want to animate this, so for example, if the camera changes the view, you just change the frame and you hit I to insert keyframe. And then you can move the frame and move the points. And you can hit I again. That when you animate, you can also animate the feathering and everything. You can use that to create kind of a controlled effect of an animated mask. So just remember to press I to do that. So you can also change the handle type. You can create parents, you can copy the splines, duplicate them, you can transform them, push, pull, share, sphere. You can clear the feather weight, and you can also set your keyframes or create shape keys and things like that. So don't remember, or do remember, sorry, do remember the mask display to turn it on because the default is off. Control left click to place, I to set a keyframe, and also make sure that you create a mask layer and select it. You can have as many layers as you want, and with that you can have as many masks as you want for as many that you need. And when you want to feather, make sure that the direction is going outwards so that it starts feathering inwards. Sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's the basis of that concept. The Killen's writing. So he's asking, how do you track the mask with video without doing it by hand? This would mean you have to go to your motion tracking layout. In this case, you open up a video. If I choose a video, let's see if I can find one hard drive. .3D stuff. There we go. Here's a video. Shorter one. So when you have a video like this, you got to load it up. And once you have loaded up the video, you can set your scene frames, and you can do your tracking tools, and you can set up like your key points that you want to track, plane tracks or tracking settings. I don't know how to use it very well, but there are very automatic ways of doing this by adding markers and things like that, and then solving the camera motion, and you can set your camera motion in 3D. It's quite powerful for a very free system. It is quite good. You can solve it, you can set your keyframes at the bottom in the craft, you can smooth them out or not. I recommend taking a deeper look into this because I don't think I can cover it right now, and I don't know it very well myself. But once you have a tracked image, you can go to your image settings of the compositor with the hair, and instead of choosing that image, I think you can choose... Oh, can you? Wait. I thought you could. I could be wrong, but as I said, I need to investigate it a bit more. So in the movie clip editor, I have a movie clip. Can I oh, I can load it. You can load movie clips here, and then you get the movie clip offset, scales, and angles. You can get the alpha, and you get the image. But can a mask call an image? Video. I may have to investigate to see if it's possible. Look, here is an example that Slink shared for adding global illumination to Eevee. Let's open up the original and take a closer look. So you've got ambient occlusion, the transmission, the glossiness, the diffuse. You're denoising some of them, and you're adding them onto each other, multiplying it, and you're adding the direction of the other settings from the other renderer onto each other, so that you have different things. Adding the different layers. Nice. Multiplying some of them. Yeah, it's basically the general concept. You can later in time, for example, when you're in a production pipeline, you usually create what you call a node script, where you have a template for compositor nodes that are already set up for the entire project, and with most of the work already done. You save that as a node group, or you save that as a scene that you can load into your projects to work your composite for later. So when you have your system set up for your pipeline, for your workflow, and you need to repeat it with multiple shots, or you want to do it for an animation, or you want to work it for multiple angles of your camera and different ways, and you need the same setup, then you can use this node script or a template to work the rest of your project with the work you have already done. In my case, what I usually do in my scenes, I usually have pre-built nodes already built in. For example, a vignette, a grain system, a color balancing system, some lens effects already created, some of them muted already, and this is kind of my default template. If you like something and you want it as your default every day, you can save your startup file from a new scene with these node setups. Some of them are groups as well. Maybe you can save them in your assets for later as well as a node group for your composites. You can just pull in your shader nodes or your compositor nodes here and click and drag and put them in. Good to go. If you use the linked data mode, when you click and drag them in, this means you can still use the parameters to plug in and out from them, but when you update them from the source file, for example, I upgrade my grain node when I update it, in this case, if I have it linked in my source asset library, this node group will update automatically if it remains linked. Very handy if you want to work with multiple projects in multiple areas as well. So Slink has said that he's been recreating the passes of Eevee and adding some global illumination on top of that by multiplying diffuse light with diffuse color, then adding specular light multiplied by specular color, then adding emission, adding the environment, and then adding volume light, adding bloom, and then you added global illumination from cycles into that particular setup. Clever! That's exactly the power of something that you can do using 2 render engines. And you replace the reflections with the ones from cycles. Smart. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You can upgrade your Eevee renders using this technique. Thanks, Link. So today I'm going to finish the stream here, I suppose. If you have more questions or art that you'd like to take a look at for later or for next week, well, as you know, I will be here, same time, same place, in the same channels, and next Friday at 2000 UTC. So thanks Link, Kalin, Pose, JC, J-Bar, Plebes, and Shmuel for getting me here in the voice chat. For everyone else who's watching later, I wish you a good weekend and happy blending. Oh, you're welcome.